Before we jump into today's episode, I have some exciting news to share with you. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, do you have any tips to help our team while we're conducting our equity audits? Well, now I do. Get my brand new ebook, 3 Essential Questions Every Equity Team Must Ask to Conduct Equity Audits That Make Real Change. It's your team's blueprint for action. Plus, the book comes with a cheat sheet guide at the end that can help your team use it to support your work. As I've been sharing it with folks, they've asked, well, is it $14.99 or is it $9.99? And you know what? I'm making it absolutely free. That's right. I just want to get this information into the hands of the people who need it for absolutely free. To get your free copy, all you need to do is to go to equityaudits.com/ebook. That's equityaudits.com/ebook. Enter your name and your best email address, and I'll send it to you right away. So grab your free copy now. All right, on to today's episode. Have you conducted a community-based equity audit to make your racial justice work more expansive? Or have you conducted a traditional equity audit but have not conducted a community-based equity audit because you're just not sure how to do it? If you've answered no to either one of these questions, then you are in the right place. Hi, I'm Dr. Terrance L. I'm a tenured professor, and I've helped to prepare hundreds of racially just and anti-racist school leaders, and I want to help you. That's why I created this podcast to provide you and your team with real-world insights and practices that work so that you can collectively build racially just schools. On today's episode, I'll be talking about how to conduct the community-based equity audit. I'll be specifically sharing with you the 4 primary phases of conducting the audit. And as I'm doing that, I'll be talking to you about some of the tweaks, some of the pivots, some of the changes that I've made in this process over the years as you work to conduct your own community-based equity audit. Before we get into today's episode, I want to remind you that this podcast is brought to you by www.raciallyjustschools.com. And when you join our community today, I will send you a free video on how to make your racial justice work better. I'm excited about you joining the community, and I look forward to meeting you. And if you're ready to get into today's episode, we will in 1 second. But first, I have a special announcer that's going to get us started.
Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast with your host, Dr. Terrance L. He's my daddy, and he's the best ever.
Let's go.
You're listening to the Racially Just Schools podcast, the show that provides resources to help you and your team build racially just schools. Now, here's your host, Dr. Terrance L.
Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast. My name is Terrance L. Green, and I am your host. Yo, what's up? I am so excited that you are here for today's episode. Now, today's episode is going to be a continuation of an episode that I did a while back. If you haven't checked out episode 33, go and check that out, please. Because in that episode, I talk about the history, how it emerged, how I started thinking about and conducting community-based equity audits, the approach that you need to have when you're conducting one. So please make sure you go back and listen to episode 33 because it will lay that critical foundation and context for you coming into this episode, which is about the how. But today is going to be a continuation of that episode. This is part 2, where I'm going to be talking about the community-based equity audit. And specifically, during this episode, I'm going to be talking about the 4 phases of how to conduct the community-based equity audit. Now, I want to say this before we start talking about these 4 phases. Conducting the community-based equity audit is the way to learn about how to conduct a community-based equity audit. So in other words, it's difficult to try to, lay out in an audio podcast format of how to conduct a community-based equity audit, because the way you learn this is by doing. You've heard me say this many of times, is that the way you learn how to swim is not sitting on the side of the pool. The way you learn how to swim is you got to jump in there at some point. And that is how you learn how to conduct a community-based equity audit. So I want you to have that context as I talk about these 4 phases. Now, I do think, learning and talking about these 4 phases will be very insightful for you, and that should be augmented with you actually going out to conduct a community-based equity audit, even if you conduct one in a more micro sense and not this larger, with multiple partners across a district or multiple stakeholders across the school. But you actually doing that is going to be super, super important, and it's going to tremendously accelerate your learning in this process. But I'm super excited to talk to you about the 4 phases of it, some of the ways I pivoted, and I'm super, super excited to hear your feedback on it. So without any further ado, let's jump on in. All right, so phase 1 of the community-based equity audit is disrupting deficit views of community. It is disrupting deficit views of community. And so one of the reasons I begin with this, and I want to say this, let me back up for a second. This is thinking about conducting a community-based equity audit where people from a school or district context is starting to engage this work. Now, people can conduct a community-based equity audit not occupying any or one of those positions, right? It could be something radically different. But I'm talking about people typically who will start conducting, even in a nonprofit space. So the first thing is that you are disrupting deficit views of community. And the way I came about this was experiences I had, in the courses I would teach and different schools and districts I would work with. And, like, hey, go spend time in the community, engage with community partners, just listen, just learn, just be within the community. And I noticed when that happened, when folks would come back, they would just essentially say the same deficit things that they thought before they went to the community. They say the same things after they came back from having these experiences in the community. And so that is what psychologists call confirmation bias. So in other words, if you think that Black parents or Latinx communities or Pacific Islander communities are at some type of a deficit, when you go to the community, engage with them, anything that you don't think fits the calculus, you will use that as evidence to say, see, I told you they didn't care about education. See, I told you they were lazy. See, I told you, know what I'm saying? So you'll engage in confirmation bias, right? And so if you're going to engage in some powerful collaborative ways with folks in communities, with families, with young people, you have to disrupt deficit views about community, all right? And so this should happen as you are creating your team of people at your particular location or context. So like if you're at a school, you're creating people in the school who are going to start to co-lead this work. You're in a district, this is the team that is being formulated that is going to co-lead this work for the district. The nonprofit, the people going to co-lead this work for the nonprofit. And so now what you should be doing, this very first phase is like disrupting deficit views of community. So as you're putting this team together, you want to think about 9 to 12 folks who could be initially a part of this team. And you want to make sure that you have folks from a myriad of backgrounds that span race, social class, positions, right? You want to make sure that you have not only just administrators and teachers, but you want to have staff people in there. You want to have bus drivers, lunch servers, administrative assistants, teacher assistants, families, parents, youth. Why? Because they all bring this powerful, powerful perspective around the work. And you want to make sure that you have, folks who have been racially minoritized. You want to make sure you have like indigenous folks, Black folks, Asian, Pacific Islander, Latinx. You want to make sure that you oversample for folks of color in this particular context so you can get an understanding. Now you say, well, I'm not in the context where I have that. So you want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence to make sure you have a team that is racially diverse and that and also methodologically in some ways ideologically diverse, as long as the anchor of that diversity is still justice and equity. Okay. Because then people are like, well, we couldn't find no Black people. And then you find somebody who has an ideology that reinforces the same, white supremacy. So that's not good. And then you're saying, well, we have a person of color on the team. No, the ideological diversity has to be anchored in racial justice and equity. during this first phase, there are a couple things you want to do as you're thinking about disrupting these deficit views. And let me just clarify this. Deficit views versus strength-based perspectives and views. Deficit views places the onus on the individual, on people, or on community. So the problem is found in individuals, the people, or the community. Therefore, the solutions are to fix the people, the individuals, or the community. Strength-based perspectives finds the beauty, the gifts, the amazing ingenuity and wisdom, lived experiences that people, communities have, and the onus is not on them, but is on the systems and the conditions in which they are living and existing. And so the work then now is not trying to fix people, but it's trying to radically transform systems and the conditions under which people live and thrive and emerge in their lives. And so this first part of disrupting deficit views is adopting this Freirean approach and this strength and asset-based perspectives of community. So this is where people are now starting to come into some deep conversation. And in this deep conversation, they're starting to talk about how the conditions in which people live in, the racial, the historical, the social, the political conditions shape what people are experiencing, right? So it's getting a clear understanding of that, and it's shifting from these traditional views or deficit views. So for an example, you may take something like, racially minoritized students who live in low-income backgrounds or neighborhoods. The traditional view may be like, these folks are lazy. They don't work hard. They need to be fixed. But this more Freirean strength-based perspective would say these folks are living in neighborhoods that are constrained by unequal power dynamics that yield inequity and oppression. But they are active change agents who can name and transform their reality, right? So you got the same, racially minoritized groups, students of color, families of color, who live in these low-income background neighborhoods and communities. But you got two different perspectives and views that you have of them. And those views and perspectives will inform the work and the actions that you take. And so another way in which you start to disrupt the deficit views is, engaging in conversations, engaging in understanding lived experiences, understanding right now the language and the discourse that people are using with families and with communities. And you start to situate that either on the continuum of being like strength-based or more deficit-based. Another way in which you start to come into this is to establish equity-based core beliefs. So in here, or I've shifted this over the years, these are like equity and justice-based dreams, right? There are these radical dreams, or what Robert E.G. Kelly called like these freedom dreams. But here's where this group, you want to start to define your core beliefs around families and around communities. One of it may be like, every single family and community has amazing radical dreams for their young people, even though they may express them in a myriad of ways, right? That is a core fundamental belief that we have about the folks that we're engaging with. And again, we're engaging with these beliefs from a strength and an asset-based perspective. Also, while you're doing this, developing these core beliefs and dreams, I often say you should have 3 to 5. I've worked with people, they've had more than that, but I think 3 or 5 is a sweet spot. But while you're doing that, you should spend quality time naming, acknowledging, racialized assumptions, myths, and stereotypes about families, about students, and about communities. And as you're doing that, that surfaces a lot of the language that people have been using, a lot of the approaches they have been using. And so we name it, we address it, we confront it, and we're making the shift to start to develop strength-based perspectives. And I have a whole bunch of different little exercises that you can go through as a team to think about doing this work. But that is kind of like on a 30,000 foot level of like this first phase. You want to start to develop these strength-based perspectives about families and communities. The second phase of the community-based equity audit is what I call conducting initial community inquiry and shared community experiences, right? So it's conducting initial community inquiry and shared community experiences. And so the whole purpose and aim and objective of this phase is to help folks from the school or the district or the nonprofit and their teams develop connections with community-based organizations, with community partners. And during this phase, you spend time in the community to start to develop connections in solidarity and time spent with one another. And so there are three particular actions that you're going to take within this particular phase. One is to conduct an initial community inquiry through asset mapping, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The next key action here is going to be conducting interviews with community leaders, both formal and informal, those who hold institutional leadership positions and those who don't hold those formal positions but actually have influence, and people come to them for resources and information. And then the third action is to have these ongoing shared community experiences. So this first part is conducting a community inquiry through asset mapping. And this is an idea that I learned from the community-based asset literature from the 90s. Essentially, folks would have these community-based asset maps. They would map the assets. They would map an asset map, literally maps the gifts, the strengths, the institutions, the organizations, the resources in a community that can be partnered and leveraged collectively to do racial justice work beyond just the school, but at these larger community levels. And so in this mapping, I used to have folks do 3 layers of maps. And I'll put a pin here right quick. It's interesting for you to do the community asset map with stakeholders from the school, but it becomes even more powerful when you collectively build these maps with young people, but also with families and communities, which makes it even more robust, because 10 times out of 10, people at the school often discount and they miss some of the resources and the assets that people in community would consider assets. There was I remember one particular context, folks were telling me about this. There was an older elder in the neighborhood who used to play a chess with the young folks. And, none of the people at school had identified, this brother as, a resource, as some strength in the community, a gift. But when you started talking to folks in the community, they immediately identified that brother, right? And so, again, doing this collectively is going to make it the most robust. But the maps. So I initially used to have people create 3 layers of an asset map. Now I've expanded that out, but I think 3 layers is a good place to start when you're thinking about this. So one category was places of worship. So this is churches, these are temples, these are mosques, these are places where people gather together and worship. Why? Because there's a long history of how places of worship have served as sites of connection, places of engagement, places of refuge, places of movement building, places where all types of capital are formulated and reproduced. And so that's one layer. Like, you need to identify and just see like where the places of worship are, because in part, there's this idea in organizing that power is organized people or organized resources. And oftentimes, places of worship, they are places where there are organized people, but also a place where organized resources can happen. So you want to be able to map that on the first layer of your map. And I've traditionally used Google Maps for this, but you can use a number of resources to start to do this map. The main thing is we're trying to now start to think and see spatially. We're trying to illustrate and not just think through words or through verbals, through just the verbal communication. The second layer is social service organizations. And then I just had this third layer just called miscellaneous. So that would be anything that didn't fit in the first 2, right? Nonprofits, financial institutions, local businesses, whatever it may be. And so essentially what you do is you create these 3 layers of the maps, and you do a 2 to 5 mile radius. I actually stopped bounding it because I'm trying to think expansively, like how do people start to think spatially and not just place-based, right? But you can bound it between a 2 to 5 mile radius and trying to just illustrate what are the assets and the resources institutionally within a local community. Now, this will vary, again, if your catchment zone or your attendance zone is one that is beyond just a local community or neighborhood, or it might be multiple ones. So there's a pivot, just a note for that. And as folks have created these maps, it is produced some profound insight. I remember one leader who created the map, and after she created the map, the school realized that there was a food pantry right across the street, and they had a sizable amount of students who were experiencing homelessness and who were unhoused. And as a result of that, they started this partnership, which I believe is still going on today, as a result of creating a map, right? So the people were literally just coming in, leaving. But this is the power of being able to see these resources in an illustrative manner. I'm going to move on for the sake of time to the interviews with community leaders. So the purpose of this is to conduct one-on-ones, meetings with leaders of organizations. And there's a number of reasons why you want to do this. You want to learn more about the community. You want to understand the ways in which this organization, their background, and the resources, and thinking about how they might partner with the school, and you might partner with them on work you want to do. I forgot to add that this stuff is layered. So in other words, when you create your asset map, you are going to identify some of the community-based organizations to where you want to go and interview some of the leaders. Okay, so it's all the data is feeding into each other, but nonetheless. You want to have these one-on-one interviews. And another thing you want to do is you want to ask them to identify who are the people in the community that may not necessarily hold a formal position, but they are leaders sure enough. They're show enough leaders. They are connecting. They have information. They have resources. People come to them for information. And those are the questions that you essentially ask. And another phase of these interviews with community leaders, formal and informal, is that you want to start creating these network maps. And I have pictures of, how you can do it real quickly with some drawing. And it becomes very powerful when you let them draw out their network maps. And then when you have all these network maps, you start making the connections. Again, organized resources, organized people. And it can be powerful. I've seen this be super powerful. And then finally, you want to have shared community experiences. This is now where, after you've had these one-on-one meetings, after you created these asset maps, you and your team should spend time in the community, in organizations, in spaces with folks, so that you can better understand what's happening, whether that's a bus route, understanding the organizations that folks in the community, young folks, deem important, whether that's like a YMCA, whether that's a shelter, whether that's a place of worship. These shared experiences also include like community meetings and rallies and marches and festivals and church services and shopping at local stores and barbershops and volunteering and after school programs, soup kitchens. There's a range of things in which you can get connected to have shared experiences with people, not for extraction, but for engaging and understanding the community and the context more, and building these partnerships that are not just for like an assignment or for an audit, but it's for real, genuine, unique partnerships that you are building with local communities. I will once say real quickly, one powerful thing that came out of this shared community experience. I remember a school leader traversed the bus route that many of the students at our school took. And one of the things that families and students have been complaining about, like, there are trees that are so overgrown at the bus stop that we're literally like 2 or 3 feet away from the traffic, and there's cars coming 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, and we're afraid of it. And so she actually experienced that being at that bus stop, and it was like very, very, very eye-opening and salient for her. Nonetheless, one of her community experiences, she's at this community meeting. Next to her is one of the city council people's chief of staff, got in contact with the chief of staff, shared this experience. Within 3 days, all those bushes were cut down, and they were working. I'm not sure what ended up happening, but they were working to get the sidewalk extended, right? And so this all came from the shared community experience, which was a part of the interviewing with the community leads, which was a part of the asset mapping. This created a powerful experience for that community, but also for the leaders and the folks on that team as they worked on something that was not necessarily directly connected to the school's test scores and outcomes, but it was connected to the larger community equity. And that's what we're after here. Phase 3 is developing community leadership team. So this is where like school leaders and people on the school team should invite folks who are formal leaders, informal leaders, to be part of this larger community leadership team, right? So it should consist of a range of community stakeholders who cover a range of diverse backgrounds, right? And then the one thing here is that this is all building on the maps and the conversations and the networks that you've built. And so this group is going to be super important because they are going to be the ones that are going to help to co-lead this work, incubate new ideas, iterate stuff quickly, prototype, ideate. And this is super important. So you want to make sure that you have formulate this community leadership team And again, I have documents on like, how to identify folks and who should be a part of it. And then once you get a part of it, the very first thing you're going to do is move into phase 4 of this work. In phase 4, I'm combining these two, is to collect equity, asset-based community data for actions. This phase of the audit has several action steps and is used to help the community leadership team better contextualize the community-based setting of the school, its assets, and the areas of inequity, right? So there are 3 kind of like actions that happen here. The first one is to collect data on school community history, because you must understand the community context, the history of the school and community. We're not coming in Columbusing anything, right? And so that first is to understand the school community history, and there are a myriad of ways to do that. The second thing is to analyze something that I call community opportunity indicators, which is an idea that I learned from the community development literature. And then finally is to conduct these critical community dialogues. So the very first action here is to collect this data on school community history. Again, like I said before, the importance of this is so that we develop a critical understanding about the current economic, political, and social histories and racial histories that we're in, and understand what shaped those histories, right? And this goes from, doing research in the archives, at the local library, at the local school. There may be some artifacts and some history there, but it also goes to having conversations from community elders and folks who have lived in the community for a long time, or used to live in the community, or folks who've worked in that community for a long time. There are a lot of resource knowledge that is endemic to communities that we start to aim to connect to in this particular phase. I go now to there's more on there, but I'll go to the next thing is to collect the data on community opportunity indicators. And you collect and critically analyze data on key opportunity and demographic indicators that have been defined not only in the literature, but more so that have been defined by students, families, and community members for their quality of life, right? So part of this work, this is why that community leadership team is important, because now we're trying to understand, like, what do folks in the community, families, parents, communities, young folks deem as like quality of thriving life? And what then are the indicators that will show us that that is happening? And that's where you want to go and to collect the data. There's much more on that, but I'll skip here for brevity's sake. The last part of this is to conduct the critical community dialogues. And this part of the audit is probably the most important and most transforming part of the audit, because you're now taking this previously collected data and you're putting it into usable information to make actions toward racial justice and equitable change, right? And so there are these 4 types of meetings that happen in these critical community dialogues. There are 4 kind of like categories of gatherings, is what I've been calling them now, that you want to have. The first one is a community aspiration dialogue gathering. And here is where we're getting our collective agreements and commitments. We're creating the boundaries for our conversations. The purpose of these particular types of gatherings is to dream about what the school and community could be and what it should be like. There's 7 questions that I typically like to ask, at least to get folks to begin with having a conversation here. Now you can do it how you want to do it on your own, but it's about like the longevity, it's about the strengths and the assets, the improvements, the resources, the participation in this work. And again, this should be broken up into large and small groups, and there are at least 3 or 4 of these that you should have. The second type of critical community dialogue is what I call community opportunity dialogue. Now, during this gathering, we are talking about community opportunity indicators of equity that you collected before, like some of the things that contribute to it, some of the potential solutions that have been shared and discussed. We share the community asset map during this time, and folks are able to contribute in some powerful ways. So we're literally reconstructing the maps. But here's the thing that I've, over the years, like, you come with something that people can react to, usually allows you to move through the process more robustly than just having nothing and people trying to create something out of nothing, which can be done. But my experience has been just giving folks something to react to can move things along much more quickly. You should have at least 2 or 4 of these because they're so important. The third type of critical community dialogue is what I call a community planning dialogue. This is where stakeholders develop their equity-focused vision and dreams for the community and the school. They're drawing on all the data that they had before so that they can collectively define their shared dream and what the community can become. This takes about 4 or 5 of these gatherings at least to begin to do this. At the conclusion of this one, we should be thinking about what those plans really look like so we can make them actionable. And then finally, the last type of gathering is what I call a community action dialogue. And the purpose of this one is to transform the information from all the previous meetings into succinct action plans. So during this meeting, the community leadership team, other folks who are participating should clearly outline the issues that are being addressed, who will address them, the resources they'll use, identify benchmarks, indicators, how we're defining what progress is, what is our radical accountability system, and because the work should not end there. And so when you think about these third and fourth phases, we got the community leadership team, and then this team is working to have these gatherings to actually do something with the information that we're collecting, and that is very iterative. Well, I hope you got something out of that. That was, again, I want to reiterate, the way you learn how to do a community-based equity audit is by actually doing it. It is extremely difficult to teach it in this manner, but I hope I shared a few ideas with you about how you can do it. Again, I am working on this class on equity audits, and I'm going to also teach a course on conducting community-based equity audits. There will be modules that folks can access, so stay tuned for that. So I hope you got something out of it, and excited to hear what comes about as you conduct your community-based equity audit. Well, that is it, folks. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it, and I am so excited and really looking forward to our time together during future podcasts. What I need you to do is to please hit the subscribe button, share with a friend, and please leave a review. Love reviews. And if you want to hear more from me, you can head on over to www.raciallyjustschools.com. That is www.raciallyjustschools.com. When you join our community, I have a free video for you on 3 tips that will make your racial justice work better. And again, if you love the show, hit subscribe, rate it, and leave a review on iTunes. And until next time, peace.